Hi, everyone. I'm here today with Joe Caserta, the founding CEO of Caserta, headquartered in New York City, and I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Joe has joined us today to talk about establishing a data organization. Today, data and having a data organization is a lot more than just a few data engineers and data scientists sprinkled around the building. So Joe, what can you tell us about establishing a data organization?
Hi, Remy. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, this is interesting times. Data has been, on the forefront or coming to the forefront of every business over the course of the last, at least decade, probably 2 decades, and primarily driven by IT up until, about 2010 when big data started becoming more commonplace, and then data scientists were born. And so then, where does the data scientist live? Does it live part of IT? Does it live part of the business? Is it its own thing? Is it part of marketing? Is it, should it be sprinkled throughout the organization? Should it be consolidated? And, we've had about a decade now to figure it out. And so, I think the answer is, it depends, right? And we're a consulting firm, so we could say that. But what it depends on is a couple of things that are fairly fixed variables. So one is your culture. And doing things depending on your culture is kind of a double-edged sword, because becoming a analytics-driven company, or being an analytics-driven company from the get-go, could potentially be a paradigm shift in general. And if you try to shoehorn it into your existing culture, it may fail. So, as your technology evolves and your business becoming analytics driven evolves, then your HR and your staffing and your organization needs to evolve. And that's the part I think that people have been struggling with the most lately. So, the invention of the chief data officer started probably 7 years ago, 3 or 4 years in after big data analytics started. And I think that was the right direction, right? So we are seeing lots of success with chief data officers, but not always success with chief data officers. And I think the big difference between a successful chief data officer and an unsuccessful chief data officer is where it rolls up in the organization, and does it have its own budget? Okay. And so, that is, I think, when you say it shouldn't be sprinkled throughout the organization, when it is sprinkled throughout the organization, the CDO is always trying to find money because it doesn't really own anything, right? It's kind of like a man with no home, or a man with no land. We need to be able to give data the same respect that you give infrastructure, and that you give marketing, and that you give finance. Data is an asset. Data is required to run the business. And so whoever's in charge of data should have a budget to maintain it. And with that budget would be personnel. So, starting with a single person like a chief data officer is a good start. But if you think about what is actually required to run a data organization, or to have a data organization, you basically want to do like 4 major things. You want to be able to do analytics, right? So you have to have a very, very analytical mind. But you also have to be very, very revenue oriented. So you need to be able to have a very financial mind. But you also have to be able to operationalize whatever it is that you're inventing with your data. So you need to have a very, very pragmatic mind. And then you have to be very, very process oriented. And so to be process oriented, operations oriented, revenue oriented, and analytics oriented, you're basically, if you could imagine, the 4 quadrants of your brain, all 4 of them are lit up at the same time when any CDO is trying to do their job. And, and it gets a little bit shrinky and a little bit nerdy, but, I think it's common knowledge that no single mind is powerful as a group or a team. And very few people can actually have all 4 parts of their brain triggering at the same time and work in unison. It's very rare. So typically you have to divide and conquer. And that's, how a data organization really needs to be thought about, is like, how do we divide and conquer all of these tasks that a CDO would be responsible for? So the easiest thing to do is to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So typically the tech probably works, and the tech you could probably leave for later because that's done by IT, and IT likes to do that. The analytics part may or may not be working for you. So maybe you have a good handle on your analytics. Maybe you need to hire a chief analytics officer, or at least, a chief data scientist, somebody responsible who's on the hook for building the insights within your organization. That could be a good staff supplement to a data organization. Also, one of the challenges, if you are trying to really make data an asset that can be used and proliferated throughout your organization, you need to have the notion of data as a service, or what's commonly known as self-service BI, right? And in order to do that, the reason why that becomes a struggle is you need what I call a data librarian. So, you can make the library, we're in New York City, across the street from the New York City Public Library. You could, the library is free. Anybody can go in, it's self-service, go find your book and take it out. But can you imagine doing that without a system, without, a way to search for your books, a way to find your books, an index of the books, a quick synapse of what is in the book, who wrote it, what is it useful for? To do that, you'd be flying blind and you'd never find what you need. And that's essentially what people are trying to do. Organizations are trying to have data as a service and BI self-service without having any kind of index of all of their data assets. So I think, you need two things. You need a tool like a data catalog or something, but that's easy. Lots of companies have them. Nobody's using them properly because they don't have anybody dedicated to being the librarian of all your data assets. And then, then you have your data stewardship committee, which typically is a part-time job. And then you have your data governance committee, which also is typically a part-time job. So I'd say, a chief data officer, a chief governance officer, maybe an analytics, VP of analytics or SVP of analytics, and your librarian. That, I think, would be a great starting point to fulfill the core competencies of a data organization.
So that's great. Those 4 pillars are a huge undertaking, though, for many companies. Can they afford, especially through the lens of a more virtual world that we're living in today, can they really afford not to become a data organization? And do you have any figures of anything supporting like the value of becoming one?
I mean, you could just look at who are the companies that are taking over the world. It's interesting, right, that like the greatest car service company in the world doesn't even own cars, right? The greatest, retail company in the world doesn't own any products. It's really not about what you have or what you do, it's how you do it. And the way you do it is to be as smart as you possibly can about what your customer needs. And in an online world, especially with the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, when we are buying the majority of our goods through media, right? Either on your computer or on your phone, the only way for any company to understand their customer is through data. And so if you don't have data at the core of your business, really driving the behavior of all your business applications and driving all of the major decisions throughout your organization, if that's not happening, you should start getting your for sale sign dusted off, because your company is really going to start losing value quickly.
Definitely. Well, that's all the time we have today, Joe. We have a webinar that you're going to be discussing more about this, which you can register in the link below. And come prepared with questions for Joe, and Joe will answer them. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks.